nice because it made me look forward to the food more, though.
Yes, this is true too. Okay, we are officially recording.
Okay, awesome. What's up, everyone?
What's up?
So I'd like I guess this is gonna be the astro theory thing. So I'm gonna totally just wing this because I think that's the most fun way to do it. Let me open my Astro Gold. I think we talked last time about the moon cycles, and what I think is going to be a really good idea here is to kind of talk a little like just in terms of the geometry of the chart and how we can start to track. I'm going to make this really simple and really cut everything down to.
Well, I like the dark background, but I think anybody who's colorblind is not going to be able to see that chart.
Okay, nice. There you go. Looking out. let me change the style. Oh yeah, here we go.
It reminds me of the forest.
Yeah, it's a forest vibe. It's the Dante vibe displayed. So this stuff is really, I think astrology is really so simple, but I think what's deceiving about it is that people make it out to be some sort of like crazy fucking powerful and mystical thing, which I guess to a certain degree it is, but it's really just, this is just the language of becoming. So what I want to do is just speak really briefly philosophically about the terms being and becoming. So being and becoming have both been used in Eastern and Western philosophy to denote essentially what would be the wheel of life, which we talked about last time, which actually is represented by the zodiac, right? If you think about all of the different sects of the zodiac, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, right? They represent these 12 signs or these 12 sects of the day. If you wanted to think about each sect as an hour or each sect as 2 hours, we divide this up into 24, 12, 3, 4, whatever permutation of the chart you want to divide it into, 6, 2 6s, or we could do 3 4s, right? And then obviously we have all of the ancient astrological types in regards to the elements, in regards to the fixity of certain signs, in regards to obviously the yin and the yang, right? So if we think about the yin and the yang, Aries yang, Taurus yin, Gemini yang, Cancer yin, we have 6 divided by 2. We could do the 4 elements. We would have 4 divided by 3, so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can divide up 12. And again, obviously, you could think of the modern clock that we use, hours 1 through 12. But the way that we're talking about becoming here is just the cycling. I'll just show the cycling. The cycling of these various different moon phases or phasal relationships between two beings. If you wanted to think about at the highest metaphysical level, a binary such as light and dark, man and woman, left and right, day and night, right? We could use any of these different binaries to represent any of the 2 archetypes. So right now we're using the sun and moon. This is the kind of dance of the cosmos, right? Or the dance of Shiva and Shakti, if we were going to talk about the Hindu tradition. And this is the dance that's the fundamental artistic process of creation in the cosmos. So conceiving of that in that sense, right? We have the dance of the moon and sun through the phases of their fullness. We could think about a romance between 2 lovers. We could think about the chasing of the day through the night and the night through the day, which is kind of what we're talking about with the sun and the moon. But obviously we're talking about that in terms of hours based on where you are, latitude and longitude on the earth. There's a lot of different ways these binaries cycle through space and time, right? Death and life and the process of rebirth that's between them. Again, you could think of life coming up to the full moon, this process of life, and then this process of illumination, and then the descent into death and the rebirth of the new moon. So this is something that I think is really fundamental about astrology. And if we understand becoming in that way, this process of life and death and rebirth and life and death and rebirth, what we're talking about here is the karmic cycle or process in the chart of becoming. This is something that obviously we talked about this last time, all human beings undergo, all life on earth undergoes. And as we see in astrology, the entire cosmos undergoes on a macrocosmic level. So if we were going to talk about, I will pull another example, right? When you and I were talking about the Saturn Pluto cycle, we're just going to pull Saturn Pluto and isolate them on the wheel here. This is also something, right? If we're talking about more of a microcosmic cycle, such as the sun and the moon, where we have 14 days between the new moon and the full moon, and 14 days between the full moon and the new moon, right? We're talking about a much larger cycle of Saturn in relationship to Pluto. If we just want to go back to the conjunction that happened in 2020, that is unfolding over a much larger span of time. And obviously, time is the relative aspect of the cosmos, right? If we're talking about Saturn as one of the rulers, or probably the ruler of time in terms of earthly time. This is a relatively much more massive cycle in relationship to the Earth and where we stand than the sun and the moon cycle as it is reflected from and seen on Earth. So when we're looking at astrology, we're really looking at these composite cycles as they dance through the cosmos, right? Here's our new moon of Saturn and Pluto that happened in right as that whole year of 2020 kicked off, right? So this is a pretty powerful archetypal signature. All we really need to understand in astrology is, again, this is just my personal theory here based on my studies. You can take it for whatever it's worth, but this is also based on some pretty significant astrological work by people like Alice Bailey, Jeffrey Wolf Green, Dane Rudyard, Liz Green, very prominent astrologists who not only have worked with these cycles in a astronomical sense, but also in terms of their mythological and psychological significance. So if we wanted to talk about the seed of the cycle, which is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, this I'll read it directly from my notes here because this might be helpful. There are a couple of different psychologists who kind of work on the fringes of psychology. There's a psychologist, Stan Groff, who works primarily in this field called non-ordinary states of consciousness, which various different sages have experienced throughout history, like the ones that started Kashmir Shaivism in the 8th century. All of the different mystics in the Christian tradition, such as Jacob or Ezekiel, who had these visions, right, non-ordinary states of consciousness, where Jacob saw Jacob's ladder or Ezekiel saw Ezekiel's wheel, right? These visionary states that actually become the fundamental principles and foundations of these religions, right? So we're going back to these sages and their understandings that they witness of this seeding of the cycle. And we'll talk about the seeding. So the new moon is the seeding of the idea, right? We could call this the impregnation. And we could go, and I'm going to take us through the 4 squares. So it's the 4 cardinal points, essentially, of the zodiac. You could think of Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn as the 4 cardinal points or stages of the zodiac, right? So we're passing through the different cardinal points as in the equinoxes, as in the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, as well as new moon, first quarter moon, full moon, third quarter moon, and new moon, right? So here we are at the square, which is going to happen in 2028 of this Saturn-Pluto cycle, where Stan Groff would call this the second matrix of birth, and this is being trapped in the birth canal. Sensation of being victim, being bombed or something like that. There's this sensation here of the birth was seeded, the child grows and develops, and now there's this sense of the child has consciousness of being trapped in the birth canal and is struggling to get out. So this would be the first quarter square, or the first moment of tension, which I think is the moment of coming to consciousness of the seeding of this cycle. So this is, for instance, maybe you could conceive of the child is conceived and the child is growing in the womb, and this is the first moment of consciousness that I am in this place between being and becoming, and I'm not necessarily, effectively trapped. So we'll call it that. And then we're moving into the full moon, which is going to happen between Saturn and Pluto. Pluto's in Aquarius here. 2036. This is the third matrix that Stan Groff calls. The cervix is open, there's movement out, and I'm moving to free myself. This would also be the moment of enlightenment, the Buddha's moment under the Bodhi tree, where there is this sense of this action that occurred over this first quarter square of coming to consciousness, and the seeding of the idea is coming to light, and I am now freeing myself from this bond, or from this birthing process. I am emerging from the womb. And here's our third matrix, which is our third quarter square. Saturn and Pluto. This is going to be 2045. So you can see this is a pretty massive cycle. We're 25 years into the cycle, third quarter square. This is the cervix is open, the movement is out, freeing myself into birth, victory, end of revolution, end of war. Right? So there's this. This is also the Saturn-Uranus square that we just had, third quarter square, which Dane Rudyard calls a crisis of consciousness square. So we now have it's effectively, it's interesting because it's another crisis, because it's that whole John Lennon thing, Merry Christmas, war is over, but now what? And now we move into this process of the new seeding, right? And so this is like a repetitious cycle that is being observed by various different psychologists and philosophers throughout history. There's an interesting thing that Stan Groff brings up that I want to talk about. There's this term called psychohistory, situations preceding the onset of revolutions and wars, etc. Right? These people research the various different psychological states of the collective consciousness in relation to the historical events that happen. So, for instance, this would be a great example of a psychosphere, or as the True Detective term, right? A psychosphere, or this happening that is occurring in the outer planetary relationship. I don't know how many people felt this, right? This was something that it was insane. I almost felt like a bird that was fleeing before a volcano or an earthquake or something, right? There was this, I felt this, I don't know who else did, but at the sense of the beginning of 2020, and in the months prior, this sense of something very fundamentally and very strongly dying, right?
Oh
This
yeah.
balsamic moon, this sliver. And then it comes up to the full conjunction. I think actually within hours, the first coronavirus case was reported in China with this conjunction. I don't know. Did you feel anything resembling that?
I felt it as far back as November.
Interesting.
It actually popped up in that's when I was still kind of learning Lenormand. So one of the things my teacher told us to do is anytime we pull cards, to make sure we write them down and pull every day, even if you don't have a question, just kind of ask like, what's in my orbit? And it kept coming up with an association of money for illness. So I was thinking, okay, is this like a lawsuit or something? And it ended up representing the stimulus that went out.
Nice. Interesting. Very interesting. Because it's like, this is the archetypal energy that's in the field. This is the sliver, the absolute waning. This is the moment of death of this cycle, right? You could even think of the moment of death of this cycle as actually occurring before and as, right, the conjunction itself, which is actually the moment of birth here, right? So this very last sliver of the moon, you could think of this as the absolute waning moment before the new moon between Saturn and Pluto, right? It becomes really simple to read astrology and think about astrology when we start to isolate the elements, right? If I was just going to pull this up and throw everything back onto the chart, it looks a lot more complicated here. But what we're looking to do when we're studying astrology here, I think, is to start to identify the archetypal energies in the field and isolate the elements and identify where they stand within each of these quarter cycles. Obviously, new moon, first quarter moon, full moon, third quarter, and fourth quarter. So you could think of it again. I'll just say it really briefly. It's not that difficult to understand these archetypal elements and the kind of cardinal points that they come into contact with. This is the Aries point here of the new moon between Saturn and Pluto. This is the moment of birth. This is like the moment of, it's like, this is the progenitation of the thought or the idea. But obviously, right, the idea is born, the thought form has to actually turn into the form itself. And so what we're talking about in terms of birth is something that's kind of complex, because you could just think of it as the metaphor that occurs in the human existence. This is actually the moment where the intercourse happens, and the I don't know, the egg enters the sperm, right? This is the progenitation moment, but there's actually this process here, which in the human the human span is 9 months. In the sun and moon span is 14 days of. I'll pull up the sun and moon because it's going to be easier to visualize this in a shorter time frame. In the sun and moon span is 14 days of the seed. This is the seeding, right? That's happening on the 23rd in 2 days, right? Right now we are in that. If you remember, right, thinking back November 2019, this is the same archetypal phase that we encountered in November 2019 before the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the beginning of 2020. This is the archetypal phase of that very moment of death, right? You could think of this almost as the moments before orgasm or the moments before seeding. Contact is made, sperm contacts the womb. The insemination process effectively happens. Enter into this first quarter phase where there's this moment of coming to consciousness here, which I think is important. There's this realization that something has been seeded and it's struggling towards birth. That's this first quarter square. This quarter square here is the birth process is happening. It's emerging from the womb. It's being realized. It's being enlightened. This separation is occurring, right? This is the moment of maximum tension. If you were going to think about if we were drawing a string, right? There's a string connected to the sun and the moon here. The string is separating. There's this moment of angular 90-degree tension. And then this moment of 180 degrees, the string is stretched to absolute point of breaking. The breaking occurs. We enter this third quarter square of crisis of consciousness, or the birth is becoming death. And we enter again into the cycle. Is what I'm saying making sense? I'm trying to like bring the metaphysics to a physical.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
So I think that's primarily what I really wanted to get at with this. And so there's a lot of different ways that this kind of stuff manifests, and what Stan Groff talks about in the psychohistory is really interesting. He talks about there are various different like actors essentially who are leading humanity through these various different birth canals. So you could think of when we have different events that happen on the full moons and new moons, prominent events that happen in the political sphere. We could think of these as sort of, these are actors who are guiding us through the birth canal by making these archetypal images or energies literal. Also, you could think of the Saturn and Pluto cycles in terms of, I'm going to pull up Uranus here because I think we're going to want to have the outer planets to talk about. I'm going to bring this back to kind of the period of Nazi Germany, because I think it's a really interesting and kind of easy way to show these energies happening. Planets.
Well, we are seeing some of those same themes, so
yeah, I'm gonna pull 1931 and I'm gonna pull 65, and we're gonna use those two. I don't want to make this video too long because I don't think it's that complicated, and I think the more complicated we make it, the less effective the message is going to be. Right, so there's this point of maximum tension here between Saturn, Pluto, square Uranus, right? So if you were thinking of someone's drawing a string and drawing a string here, these outer planets are experiencing the Saturn. Let me see if I can get this right. We're in a third quarter square between Saturn and Uranus, which interestingly enough is the exact third quarter square that we just had. 2020, 2021, 2022, third quarter square between Saturn and Uranus. Although they're in different archetypal spaces, this is the Saturn that we encountered during 2020, 20 degrees Capricorn. Opposite, at the point of maximum tension, this is Saturn's point of maximum tension from Pluto. Uranus is encountering a third quarter square from Pluto. So this cycle is at the moment of crisis of consciousness. This cycle is at the moment of crisis of consciousness. And this cycle is at the point of maximum tension. So if you want, I don't want to go into the archetypal dynamics of Uranus and Aries, or Saturn in Capricorn and Pluto in Cancer. This is power relating to home or foundations. This is sudden events relating to, you could think of the archetypal Mars energy. And this is Saturn obviously relating to the foundations and structures of what we perceive as the limits of reality. So you can see these maximum points that are all being stretched: full moon, third quarter square, third quarter square. What Stan Grof talks about in psychohistory, and this is also something obviously that comes up with Richard Tarnas and Cosmos and Psyche. Richard Tarnas and Stan Grof work very closely together and have worked very closely together for some time at California Institute for Integrative Studies. What he's discussing here is in psychohistory, situations preceding onset of revolutions, wars, etc. 1931 here, we're talking about. There are various different actors who are leading us through the birth canal of these massive squares, right? So I want to talk about squares specifically because I don't, sure, we could talk about trines, sure, we could talk about sextiles, but what I want to talk about here is striking moments, powerful striking moments, and these occur at the quarter dates. If you want to talk about, again, the cardinal points.
Yeah,
Aries.
the tipping point.
Yes,
like I looked
point.
at this chart and I see this as this is one moment in history where this is exactly when the tipping point happened. Whatever it was, however benign it was the tipping point for what happened next.
Exactly. This is a moment, if you could think of all of the seasons are turning. It's like all of the seasons are turning at once in these archetypal relationships: third quarter square, full moon. And what we're discussing here, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, these are massive cycles that are all reaching, as you said, the tipping point. Stan Grof says, figures of speech from biological birth, enemies closing in, squeezing us, choking us. Hitler says, we don't have enough space to live. Enemy is going to swallow us. He says, the spider, the snake, and the dragon are various themes and archetypes that continually emerge during these. I'm gonna take it into the astrology because he unfortunately didn't have very much of a chance to during his time in research, during these archetypal squares and oppositions between the outer planets, which become these moments of massive tension, right? We're not just talking about a full moon here. We're not even just talking about a like a lunar eclipse where the nodes are involved, but instead we're talking about massive outer planetary cycles, which take, in Saturn's case, decades, in Uranus's case, decades, in Pluto's case, hundreds of years, literally, to reach points of fulfillment. So there, what Stan Grof does is interesting. I was talking about the birth matrices, and this is something that he observes in his practice with psychedelic sessions and holotropic sessions. A holotropic sessions means a journey towards wholeness or a becoming towards wholeness. He uses different breath work and meditation styles for people to have these experiences. Stan Grof says that people relive these, he calls them perinatal experiences between birth and death, where the fetus is coming to consciousness, and some of the really first primary experiences we have in this incarnation, regardless of whether or not we remember them at a psychological level, we remember them at a somatic level. They're remembered in the body of this struggling to birth. So what Stan Grof says is that there are these actors that emerge at these different tipping points in history, right? We're thinking at a cosmological level of these massive outer planetary cycles, which are tipping points into birth and into death. These actors come out, and because he says, because they are so maybe subconsciously in touch with these underground wellings up of emotion and feeling of tension, which these cycles of birth and death that the planets are undergoing are the same cycles of birth and death we undergo, right? But we're seeing them at the archetypal level on a cosmological scale. These actors channel these energies and show us these birth and death cycles as they unfold and emerge. He talks about Alexander the Great. There's light at the end of this tunnel. I will lead you to the light, and we will all breathe freely. These leaders give the solution in the language of biological birth, which is ultimately just rhetoric, right? But it mimics these archetypal energies that are at play in the field. People are looking for ways to emerge into life and into breath in the struggle of the birth canal, out of the biological womb or out of the cosmological womb. So this is some really interesting stuff. You can look this up with Stan Grof, the perinatal matrices. And he references someone, it's Lloyd DeMouse is the name, who does this psychohistory, and his findings about the perinatal experience images accompany these periods of war and revolution that Rick Tarnas talks about in his book Cosmos and Psyche. So it's like, it's a way, if you think of like rock stars or artists or whatever, what they're doing is channeling the subconscious or the fundamentally human as we cycle through these cosmological experiences of death and rebirth, I'm going to pull up 65 as we discussed. What they're doing is channeling these archetypal energies and bringing them down to Earth. Right, here's another Saturn opposition to Pluto conjunct Uranus. This, right, if we're talking about the archetypal, it's interesting if you look at 65 and 30, if I just wanted to draw this all the way back through, look at the tension emerging again in the Saturn relationship, phasal relationship to Pluto. Just keep an eye. I'm going to remove Neptune here because I think this will be a really useful and interesting archetypal dance to witness. Remove Neptune and just watch as this progression occurs between 31 and 65. I'm going to go really slowly. You can see Saturn catching up to Uranus, conjunction to Uranus in 41, Saturn conjunct Pluto in 46, and let's just take it all the way to 65. You have another moment of maximal tension between Saturn and Pluto, but also Saturn Uranus. So you could think of, I don't know, very interesting artists during this period. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, different energies that emerged during this period of time. What are you thinking about here?
There's lots of artists that emerged during this time, and I mean, if you think about it, when people talk about the greats in music, they are literally almost all of the artists they mention are coming from this era. So Hendrix, Joplin, obviously the Doors, with Morrison. Let me see here. Who else is there? Oh my God, how am I forgetting his name? He's probably Bob Dylan during this time. You got.
Yeah, and this is all occurring right during the Saturn opposition Pluto Uranus in Virgo and Pisces. That's a incredibly creative archetypal axis. I can't think of another one that would really approach that in terms of the kind of the Pisces artistry element, right? Bringing that into the everyday life. And this is the completion of that Uranus Pluto square from 31. Right. This was the last 30 years that this comes to a close, and this is the birth or the seeding of the new Uranus Pluto cycle, but also the moment of maximum tension with Saturn against the Saturn Uranus cycle and the Pluto Saturn cycle. So it's these larger archetypal energies and forces which build to various different culmination points, and I think we see the exaggeration, the very exaggerated moments of tension when these outer elements come to a point like this or in 31, which again is directly related to the squares and oppositions, right? Another perfect moment here of maximum tension. And obviously you could dig into each of these archetypes individually, which would take a pretty long time to go into this too much longer. But I guess what I'm trying to talk about here is there's this archetypal transference that's happening. There's this resonance through the celestial spheres. If you want to talk about, this is a cosmological moment in time that is incredibly powerful and full of a lot of weight and gravity. If we're just looking at the astrology as well as just the astronomy in terms of the force in mass that is gathering in phasal relationships of a square, right, 90 degrees, or 90 degrees, that moment of tension, and 180 degrees, that moment of tension. If you're thinking about bodies that are in space interacting in that way, particularly bodies that are as big as Saturn, or if we were going to talk about Jupiter as well, or Uranus, this resonance that happens through the celestial spheres that translates the archetypal information through various densities or levels of manifestation. So this is happening at the metaphysical level, but what else is happening at the physical level, right? This is the rise of Nazi Germany. 65, what's happening? There's these various different revolutions that are occurring in Paris, in the United States, as well as this outburst of incredibly powerful and revolutionary music, which again is a huge Pisces Virgo axis theme. Kurt Cobain is someone who really prominently has the Pisces Virgo axis activated. So I think this is a really great way to approach astrology, is that in these moments of maximum tension, there are, I'll pull back to Nazi Germany because I think this is an interesting example. There was a lot of shamanic imagery being used in Nazi Germany, drumming, myths of Nordic supremacy, obviously all the symbols that they appropriated from various different pagan traditions, introducing these deep wells of archetypal imagery into what otherwise was a superficial life or everyday. Obviously, after World War I, Germany was decimated economically, socially, politically, culturally. There's this mystical or mythical impulse that penetrates into the everyday life, an impulse to deeper meaning and spiritual meaning, right? Which obviously is a huge Pluto theme. It's whenever we're seeing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's interesting because like I only recently, probably within the last decade of, doing my own research and stuff, did I even find out that the Nazis studied esoteric sciences and technologies as deeply as they did.
Mhm.
And looking at this chart, like you're mentioning with Pluto, I wonder if there was a scenario, alternative universe, if you will, where after World War I, the country wasn't decimated in all those ways. Would they have still taken that approach to give an excuse to their hatred, basically?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look at this in terms of some Germany natal charts, if you will, right? But I think this is the archetypal energy, and it's going to find a way to manifest.
Yeah.
Like if we're talking, whether we're talking about in terms of a nation, or we're talking about in terms of the earth, or we're talking about in terms of the individual, it's looking at these themes. And I think it's really, if we really stick with the outer planetary transits and the quarters, as we discussed, these kind of 4 quarters, the new moon, first quarter moon, which is the coming into consciousness, so to speak, the full moon, the realization, and the third quarter moon, the crisis of consciousness, and back obviously into the underworld to a new birth. If we're looking at these cycles, it's, I don't want to say we can predict the crisis, but we can predict the crisis in consciousness. And I think that's what's really powerful when we're using astrology, because it's not just, and I think it's so easy to get caught up if we're just going to like pull up just this massive amount of archetypal information, and we're trying to sit here and we're trying to decipher the chart, and we get caught up in the moon cycles, and we get caught up in trying to figure out what is this whole mess that's going on. Finding our way to in the higher levels, right? Or in the higher, if we're looking at these transpersonal planets here, which is something that you and I were discussing in terms of Hellenistic astrology, if we're taking this into the modern context and using I would call these the metaphysical planets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saturn is the bounds of reality, or the limits of what we can observe, right? So I would include Saturn here because it's useful, because Saturn is translating this metaphysical archetypal information into the field of consciousness that people within their rational, deductible, logical minds, or whatever, are observing, or whatever you want to call it, right? This is something that is apparent, or becoming apparent. So Saturn's useful in interpreting these outer planetary cycles. This is a great way to use astrology as a tool to understand how this outer metaphysical archetypal information is translating into what looks like, but really is not, that much more of a complicated situation when we're introducing these like the Jupiterian bodies, asteroid field stuff, and the personal planets.
So wait, did Neptune not play any major part in these transits you're talking about?
Well, let's take a look. I would doubt that it didn't, but I was just trying to make this as reducible as possible to get the information to come through in an understandable way.
I gotcha.
Yeah, so different cycles here, trine to Saturn. Well, I mean, it's always playing a part, right? So you can see that it's approaching the first quarter square from Pluto. It's approaching, well, Uranus is it's finished and it's moving through the full moon that it had with Uranus, and Saturn is approaching the full moon with Neptune. So, I mean, the Neptunian theme is going to be there, but I think what is important, and sometimes it's easier with astrology to look back than it is to look forward, but by looking back, we're able to look forward, is
Mm-hmm.
that we can observe this point of maximum tension here, and we can go into an archetypal discussion of how this is manifesting. And if we want to pull the chart however many years into the future, we see that signature manifest again. Or maybe let's say instead of Uranus square Saturn and Pluto, it's Neptune square Saturn and Pluto in like the opposite sign or something like that. So we're using this information that we garnered from this archetypal T-square of the outer planets in 1931, not only looking at, like, let's just say Nazi Germany, but we could also look at the art and culture that's emerging during this period of time. This is also Weimar Germany, right? Which was a pretty, if you want to look at the Uranus Aries and Pluto Cancer and Saturn Capricorn, Weimar Germany is a great example of Uranus in Aries. It was a period of this outpouring of creative expression, not only in terms of people's lives, but people's art, that surpassed any sort of like structural reality or context, right? It was a period of pretty debauched kind of Mars behavior that really blew past this kind of Saturnian ground of the social and cultural paradigm. If you want to look at Saturn, the bones of society in Capricorn, but also was coming from this place that there's this huge wellspring of life that was coming through this foundation in the underground of what people felt it meant to be a human being after all of this chaos and destruction had occurred from World War I. It was kind of like stripping away the foundational belief of what it meant to be a human being or what it even meant to be German. But in doing so, right, it also did strip away a lot of these foundations of what the German identity was and meant. And also, just in terms of my analysis of the history and the psychology, plays a huge part in what happens at the end of Weimar Germany, which was very similar to the fall of Rome in the sense that a lot of the morals and cultural standards went out the window. Saturn, Uranus, square opposite Pluto, square Uranus, and allowed someone like Hitler to make the statements of the Nordic supremacy or the rise to power through reconsolidating the German identity, which really didn't even exist after World War I in Weimar Germany. It was this call back to the ancient history or the underground of the German national identity through various different people who really assembled these kind of pseudosciences of cultural power and attempted to assert them as political fact.
Yeah, if I kind of think that if as a country, Germany hadn't been so vulnerable from the outcome of World War I, that, I mean, like you said, this certainly would have manifested in a different way, but I don't think he would have been as successful as he was had they been in a better place. It's almost like how when there's some type of crisis, very often people will turn to religion and spirituality as a result of that, right? And it's almost like he preyed upon that at just the right time to end up on the wrong side of history.
Right. Well, if you look at the archetypal energies that are manifest here in the maximum tension between at least these three of them, this is the perfect moment of a right time for an archetypal energy like that to manifest. And again, if you want to look at 2020, and if I wanted to throw Jupiter in there too, and then obviously the square to Uranus that happens afterward, this is a moment, if we're going to look at the archetypes, Capricorn, societal foundations, Saturn and Capricorn at its home, societal foundations and structures, Pluto, societal foundations and structures undergoing a massive change, and Jupiter, massive again, all consolidated in this sign of Capricorn. This is the perfect moment for that archetypal information to emerge. It's not necessarily right. I mean, I guess there are a lot of astrologers who are going to go into like the very minute details of exactly how it's going to emerge. And there's obviously a lot of different ways to approach that in different styles and theories, but it's, I think, looking at these moments of archetypal information that gather, particularly in terms of the outer planets, which have a pretty significant influence just in the gravity of their movement, and seeing where they constellate in these transitional cycles, right? This is a new moon of Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto all at once. This is a the moment of death and rebirth of these cycles occurring in Capricorn with archetypal Pluto, archetypal Jupiter, archetypal Saturn. It can be a little distracting to have a lot of these personal planets in, but if we really do focus on, at least I think, in terms of those 4 quarters,
Mm-hmm.
and we see those 4 quarters as how they play out, we're going to be able to pinpoint a lot of these kind of massive events, not only in the collective consciousness, but in our personal lives.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts? Anything thinking?
Well, just, I mean, the pattern is interesting. Like you said, yeah, sometimes have to look back in order to look forward. And a lot of this stuff, like we can even see right now, is kind of playing out again. So I think I have a deeper understanding why so many astrologers are concerned about Uranus returning for the US.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot to marinate on.
Well, here's your Saturn Uranus 3rd quarter square 2021. Here's your Saturn Uranus 3rd quarter square 1931. It's obviously, right, this is in Taurus. It's going to be much more based around the material as opposed to the kind of Aries Mars energy, material, Taurus, Venus values, but particularly material in Taurus as opposed to Libra. And Saturn in Capricorn, which again it's the return of that same Saturn societal structures theme in the 3rd quarter square. This, I would argue, is a lot more explosive. Uranus in Aries is much more of a powder keg than it is in Taurus, when it would be more of it's the earthquake of the material.
Right.
So this is like a powder keg that's just waiting to go off. In relation to 3rd quarter square crisis of consciousness, Saturn and Capricorn, the structures and foundations of society. I guess I would say structures because foundations would be more Pluto. But nonetheless, right, this is the same archetypal relationship in terms of the phase. If we want to go 100, it's really exactly 100 years later.
Wow.
No, 90 years later, rather. There you go.
You know, I wonder if whatever it is at this time is going to be more visible, more broadly than it was with the stuff going down over in Germany.
Yeah, what's also interesting, right?
It's on the day part of the chart.
If we want to remark that 90 years, 3rd quarter square Saturn, Uranus, Saturn opposite Pluto, square Uranus. Here we have Saturn, Pluto conjunction, square Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to be more visible? We're looking at, this is a local thing. So we would really have to decide where it's going to be more visible.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, with Uranus there in the 12th house, I mean, it's like, even if whatever is being connected to Saturn and Pluto is more visible, how it's affecting or the ripple effects of it, I think, are more hidden with Uranus being there in the 12th.
Yeah, well, this
at least for this chart anyway.
Yeah, this is going to change literally by
location.
Minute. Yeah, by minute and by location. So you can't really read the houses on this as much as, again, right, if we're focusing on these outer planets, what we want to focus on is, I think, first and foremost, the phasal relationship. New moon, 1st quarter, full moon, 3rd quarter, new moon. As well as, obviously, the archetype itself, if we can think of any sort of metaphors, structure, bones, as well as the sign that it's in. And I think it really does get that simple. And I think especially for people who are just learning, or people who are learning or even intermediate who are watching this, it's easy to get caught up. This would be like getting caught up in the drama here. Like there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that are shaking, but this is kind of zooming out here into the metaphysical situation. We can see the drama. If we wanted to add the nodes here, I think we could add the nodes. We could also add Jupiter, because Jupiter is going to shine a spotlight.
Yeah.
But this is the drama. This is getting out into the eagle's perch, right? If we're going to talk about the end of Scorpio and the beginning of Sagittarius, it's the Phoenix rising to the eagle's perch, which is kind of where we are right now. Taking a look at the eagle's perch and seeing these larger metaphysical archetypal energies in their various phasal relationships playing out. So, right, Saturn, Uranus square separating. Saturn's moving forward at a clip now and is going to come in from that third quarter square into the conjunction. So the themes that we're seeing now in relation to Saturn and Aquarius and Uranus and Taurus are going to emerge again, I think, and we're going to see them die. This kind of moment of death, right? The sperm entering the womb. And again, the birth of a new phasal relationship, which I think is going to be something entirely new. But again, it's not happening in a vacuum. Something entirely new, influenced by and with the death of the former paradigm, which reached the crisis of consciousness here in 2022, is Saturn Uranus third quarter square, the conjunction happening in 2032. So this is a 10-year kind of, we've had the crisis of consciousness, and this paradigm is dying off in relation to the Saturn Uranus archetype, and there is a new seeding of a new idea. Yeah, that's about all I got. I probably got to go eat some food.
Yeah, I don't have anything. This was kind of all on you.
Cool. Yeah, I hope that was like informative or interesting, or maybe made things a little bit clearer, because I don't think astrology needs to be that complicated. If you have a foundational understanding of the archetypes, right? If you have some sort of constellation of their meanings, right? Different metaphors to talk about Uranus and Saturn. If you have that, you have a basic understanding of the zodiacal wheel and what each of the signs represents in terms of the rulership, as well as maybe some metaphors for them. It's really just as simple as combining those. Like if we're just talking about Saturn and Aquarius, let's get a couple of keywords. Let's get a couple of keywords for Saturn and Capricorn and see the phasal relationship. The idea, the coming to consciousness, the enlightenment or the revelation or the emergence, third quarter square, the crisis of consciousness. Now what? Into the death and the new cycle. Yeah, I hope that is somewhat helpful and informative.
Yep. All right, guys. That's it. Leave your comments below.
Peace.